take your copy of God's Word and join me at Esther chapter 9, I do pray that you have the blessed assurance that you will soon be in that Beulah land. I appreciate those songs and hope that you have been blessed by the singing of the hymns of praise to the Lord. Esther chapter number 9, we've come very near to the end of this somewhat short, some of you are smiling already, somewhat short historical narrative of the exiled Jews in the Persian Empire. And some commentaries title this section, "It's All Over But the Crying," because from this point on it's about the crying and the celebrating. But I would ask that you consider God's promises and that you consider God's providence. You ever notice that sometimes we seem to live in fear and sometimes we just pine away waiting for the next shoe to drop, waiting for the next event? You know, maybe you were young and you did something that you knew you weren't supposed to do, and mom and dad are away, and you know they're going to see it just as soon as they get home, right? Or maybe you had parents that were like mine, and mom wasn't the disciplinarian. She says, "But dad's coming home," and when your dad gets home, you know, and you're just waiting for that next shoe to fall, right? Well, if you followed along in our history, our story of Queen Esther and Mordecai and all of these things, you know that Haman's already been hung, and you know the second decree has already gone out by the time we get to chapter 9, and so now 9 months have passed since the events of chapter 8. So between chapter 8 and chapter 9 there's a 9-month gap, and these two opposed decrees have already been proclaimed from the citadel. They've already been published throughout the entire Persian kingdom. There is actually, if you think of it, a civil war that has been authorized from the king. There's a date that has been set for the attack. The Jews' enemies have had 9 months to articulate their plans. They've had 9 months to amass their posse. They've had 9 months to acquire all the provisions for their attack against God's people. But for the Jewish people, for God's people, there's been 9 months to contemplate whether this new decree would actually be fulfilled. Could it be trusted? Can we put our confidence in this new guy? Is our hope, is our faith, is our trust misdirected? Is he a conspirator as well? The days have finally counted down. The 9 months have passed. The tensions have ratcheted up. Surely you've been there. And finally the date has come. The sands have slipped through the hourglass, if you will, and now, to use a modern phrase, it's go time. Will God provide? Will God's people prevail? Let's read, first of all, the confrontation. In Esther chapter 9, starting in verse number 1, we'll read of the confrontation. "Now in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's commandment and his decree drew near to be put into execution, in the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, though it was turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them that hated them, the Jews gathered themselves together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hand on such as sought their hurt. And no man could withstand them, for the fear of them fell upon all people. And the rulers of the provinces and the lieutenants and the deputies and officers of the king helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went out throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater. Thus the Jews smote all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, and slaughter and destruction, and did what they would unto those that hated them. And in Shushan the palace the Jews slew and destroyed 500 men. Oh, here's these names. You struggled this morning in Sunday school, now I'm going to struggle now. and Parshidatha, and Dalphon, and Ashpatha, and Poratha, and Adaliah, and Aridatha, and Parmashtha, and Arisai, and Aridai, and Vajazetha, the 10 sons of Haman, the sons of Hamadatha, the enemy of the Jews, slew they, but on the spoil laid they not their hand. On that day the number of those that were slain in Shushan the palace was brought before the king. And the king said unto Esther the queen, the Jews have slain and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the palace, and the 10 sons of Haman, what have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is thy petition, and it shall be granted thee, or what is thy request further, and it shall be done? Then said Esther, if it please the king, let it be granted to the Jews which are in Shushan to do tomorrow also according unto this day's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged upon the gallows. And the king commanded it so to be done, and the decree was given at Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. For the Jews that were in Shushan gathered themselves together on the 14th day also of the month Adar, and slew 300 men at Shushan, but on the prey they laid not their hand. But the other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together and stood for their lives, and had rest from their enemies, and slew of their foes 70 and 5,000, but they laid not their hands on the prey. This first 16 verses is the confrontation between the Jews and the enemies, the ones that Haman had set into motion to destroy them. First of all, in the first verse, I want you to see the reversal stated. Deliverance had been delayed. We covered that last week. Deliverance had been delayed for 9 months. The declaration was made in the 3rd month, that is in the month Sivan, in the 23rd day, we read in chapter 8, verse number 9. This now, in chapter 9, is the 13th day of the 12th month. That is the month Adar. Adar corresponds roughly to our month of February or March. The enemies had hoped to have power over the Jews, but instead the Jews have had power over their enemies. The reversal had been promised, and now in the first verse we see that the remnant has been protected. God is faithful. God is faithful. If we read nothing else today, we can summarize the entire book of Esther right there in chapter 9, verse number 1. The reversal was promised and the remnant was protected. Everything else is just cleanup. Everything here is complete. The rest of the story is details. They're not unimportant details, but they're just details. From verses 2 through 5, we see the reversal now specified. These verses are the details of how reversal was accomplished. Every great mystery novel, and this is certainly a mystery novel, every great mystery novel reveals for us the villain. It tells us who done it. And then in case you miss the details, it tells us how. It tells us how the villain got it done. Here, the Jews banded together in all the provinces where they were located. That is verse number 2. In verse number 3, the author tells us that even the officials of the empire somehow decided to help the Jewish people. Why? Well, they were afraid. They were afraid again of the prime minister. In verse number 4, we see that the fear of the prime minister has persisted. This time, the prime minister is the man named Mordecai. Mordecai, the Jew. In verse number 5, this man named Mordecai has continued to increase both in his influence and in his power. Notice the unstated principle here. Nobody wants to go against the new administration. Nobody wants to confront the new leaders. I wonder if this looks anything like we see today in a new corporation or in a corporation that hires a new manager. A new manager comes in, he takes a week or a month or a quarter, and then what does he do? He cleans house. You've heard of a hatchet man before, right? The company is sinking. The company is losing profits. We hire a new manager. The new manager comes in. He spends a pay period. He spends a month. He spends a quarter observing. Now I know where the problems are, and I know where the products are. These guys are gone, and these guys come in. That's what we see here. The reversal specified. Now we see in verses 6 through 12, the reversal is summarized. In the citadel of Susa, verse 6, 500 men are slain, including verses 7 through 10, the 10 sons of Haman. Notice here, however, that the decree of Mordecai, as we said earlier, was a defensive decree. The Jews were not given permission to go attack their enemies. They were only granted permission to defend themselves against the attack of those that would come against them. And so that leads us to knowing that these 10 sons of Haman were enemies of the Jews, and on this day they deferred to the king's first decree, and they attacked the Jews. And therefore the Jews were able to successfully defend themselves and kill the sons of Haman. The 10 sons of Haman attacked the Jews, and that's why they were killed. They were killed in battle. I'll make this point. Malice runs deep. You've heard that before. You heard that in chapter 2. You heard it again in chapter 3. Feuds run deep. They pass to your descendants, and your feuds pass to your children, and your feuds that ruin you will ruin your children as well. In verse number 11, we see that the report is then sent back to the king. This report now that is given to the king, he reacts in shock. This is a surprise statement by the king. Verse number 12, his reaction in surprise and shock. 500 have been killed in the capital city. All 500 men in the capital city. You've killed all 10 sons of Haman. And this is part of a question. If you have killed 500 within the capital city, if you've killed 500 of these that are the loyalists of Haman, and you've killed all of his 10 sons, which no doubt banded together, then what could have possibly been destroyed in the provinces and in the villages? If this sizable slaughter has commenced within the city, surely there's no defense that could have stood in the villages, in the outlying areas where the forces of anti-Semitism have even less support than what Haman himself has drummed up within the capital of Susa. That's a question that the king asked. And certainly the king's answer is given in verse 16 when he sees and he learns that 75,000 were slain in the rest of the provinces. The king's question, rhetorical question, is certainly answered in the affirmative. 75,000. What a slaughter to those who would attempt to destroy God's people, even after the decree is given that the Lord will stand for his people. J. Vernon McGee said it this way. He said, "Well, my friends." Some of you know who J. Vernon McGee is, right? I'll do my J. Vernon McGee imitation later. He said this: "The Jew has attended the funeral of every one of the nations that has tried to exterminate him." And that is true. In verses 13 and 14, we see the reversal that is signaled. These verses describe, in verses 13 and 14, a proposal by Queen Esther on how to deal with the remnant of Haman's household. How will we deal with the remnant of the household of Haman, which, by the way, has already been given to her, right? You see, the capital city here contains a number of loyalists to Haman. And so Esther pleads for another day, an extra day, an additional day for the Jews to continue their defense against their enemies. This request is often interpreted as her being vindictive. It's not. She's not being vindictive. Understand that this permission is given but it's only given for the capital city of Shushan. She only requests for an additional day that is only effective within the capital city of Susa. Again, it's a defensive decree. Why is this appeal needed? She puts forth this appeal because within this capital city, you understand, many living in this capital city are Haman's family. It's Haman's followers, if you will. It's many of Haman's friends. So Haman's loyalists could rightly be suspected of conspiring against this new prime minister. There could be plotting the revenge for Haman's death. Certainly we know that the 10 sons of Haman had already enlisted assistance. All 10 of them have attacked the Jews. That's why they were killed. At least 500 others, perhaps their assistants, had attacked the Jews. That's why 500 in the city of Shushan were killed. And so to enforce here that no loyalty against the crown, no loyalty against the queen, no loyalty against the kingdom will ever be tolerated, Esther requests now the 10 bodies of Haman's sons to be put on display. Now, if you were told in Sunday school as a child that the 10 sons of Haman were executed by hanging, you were told a falsehood. Surprise, how many times has this book been misinterpreted before? Notice in verse 10, the 10 sons of Haman are already dead. The king acknowledges their defeat in verse number 12. And now in verse number 14, he grants the request of Esther for their hanging. We've already learned earlier in this book what that word really means, right? The bodies of these 10, like their evil father, are humiliated by impaling and being put on a public display. In the Hebrew scriptures, in the Hebrew writings, the Hebrew scroll containing Esther, these 10 names, verses 7 through 10 in our Bible, are arranged in a single column in the page, and they form a picture. The 10 names are written in a single column that forms a picture of the instrument upon which they were impaled. And so I want you to understand that it's not only the vocabulary, but in the original Hebrew Bible, the illustration leaves no doubt as to their method of destruction. Verses 14 through 15 and 16 also show that the reversal is sustained. It wasn't just partial, it was continuing. This extra day is granted by the king. Adar the 14th now. On Adar the 14th, we see that an additional 300 persons in the city of Susa, in the capital city, are discovered and destroyed because of their disloyalty. Now we see a total of 800. 800 individuals in the capital have been ferreted out. They've been discovered of being disloyal to the king, of being enemies of the Jews, of being directly involved in a plot against God's people, and they have attacked the Jews, and they've been destroyed in a defensive maneuver by the Jewish people. The remainder of the Jews in the far reaches, in the far villages, the remote places of the empire have finished their defense, we read here, on the 13th day, and they have slain some 75,000 enemies of God's people. And now we read here on the 14th day. On the 14th, all of God's people have this key word, rest from their enemies. They have rest from their enemies. And if you remember all the way back in the earlier messages when we studied in chapter number 3, verse number 8, Haman told the king, it is not to your advantage to suffer them, to suffer the Jews. That word is the same word that is translated here as the word rest. Specifically, Haman told the king, Xerxes, you never let these people ever find rest in your empire. And now, on 13th and the 14th of the month Adar, the Jews have rest. There has been a reversal. But I also want you to see the reversal is sustained. But there's a reversal here of the spoils. And I want to cover this quickly. Because they had permission. If you remember the decree, when Haman's decree was given and Mordecai's decree was given that reversed or contrasted the decree of Haman, it said you could defend yourself against all of those that would come against you on this particular day. And you could also destroy their families and take their spoils. If someone comes against you on these days, you can destroy them, destroy their families, and reap the spoils of war. But there's a reversal. Did you notice 3 times as we read through that text? In verse number 10. At the end of the verse, of verse number 10, but on the spoil laid they not their hand. At the end of verse number 15, but on the prey they laid not their hand. And at the end of verse number 16, but they laid not their hands on the prey. You see, we mentioned last week that these events represented God's righteous judgment being enacted by God's representatives. But I want you to know that human representatives can do the work of God, but when we do, we are always imperfect. All of our righteousnesses are as filthy rags, and even when we do the work of God, we do it imperfectly. Carrying out God's verdicts is a heavy responsibility. Some call this concept a holy war. I'll let you wrestle in your own mind whether that is true or not. But I will tell you that within this Old Testament concept, when the nation of Israel was told to do and to perform the righteous judgment of God, there were never to be spoils. In Genesis chapter 14, verses 21 through 24, Abraham refused to take spoils from the king of Sodom because the king of Sodom was ruler over a wicked government, and he said, I'll not take spoils from you, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abram rich. In Joshua chapter 6, we led right up to it this morning, but we didn't get quite there. When Joshua led the children of Israel into Canaan, Israel marched against a city called Jericho, and they were commanded to spare nothing, and they were commanded to take nothing. Every valuable that was turned over in the city was to be left alone. Anything that was taken was to be taken and placed into the treasury of God. And in the next chapter, in Joshua chapter 7, Israel suffered a terrible defeat. They lost 36 valiant warriors at a little bitty town called Ai. You remember why? Joshua chapter 7, verses 10 and 11 tell us, the Lord said to Joshua, get thee up, wherefore liest thou thus on thy face? Israel has sinned. They have also transgressed my covenant, which I commanded them. For they have even taken of the accursed thing, and have stolen, dissembled also, and they have put it even amongst their own stuff. They took what they weren't supposed to have. They took the spoils of righteous vengeance that belonged to God. Same concept that we see when we studied earlier. You remember the conflict between Mordecai and Haman. It was the old conflict between an Agagite and a king named Saul, which we read about in 1 Samuel 15. I'll read verses 9 through 11. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and the oxen and the fatlings and the lambs and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them, but everything that was vile and refuse, that they destroyed utterly. Then came the word of the Lord to Samuel, saying, it repenteth me that I have set up Saul to be king, for he has turned back from following me, and hath not performed my commandments. And it grieved Samuel, and he cried unto the Lord all night. Now, at this point, you remember earlier we studied that the prophet Joel had that phrase that in chapter 4, finally, Mordecai repented. At this point, in Esther chapter 9, there's a defeat of the Jews' enemies. And there is finally a full defeat of the Jews' enemies. And they would not take the spoils. Finally, they got it. Leave it. Leave it all because we don't need it. Why? Because of the same thing that we heard in Sunday school. The Lord is my portion. My bounty is from God. The Lord is my portion. The Lord supplies my need. The Lord gives me a great reversal. It's not from our enemies. It's not from the king of the Persian Empire. It is from the king of the universe. And the author here stresses that point so that we don't miss it. There are no spoils taken. Let me pull this down into our modern, normal vernacular. You don't take any revenue from the destruction of your adversaries. When God destroys your enemy, you don't rejoice over it. I'll move on. That's the confrontation. Let's read the celebration. There's a celebration here, starting in verse number 17. On the 13th day of the month Adar, and on the 14th day of the same, rested they, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Now, it seems like I just contradicted myself, doesn't it? We're going to sort that out in just a minute. Verse 18. But the Jews that were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day thereof, and on the 14th thereof, and on the 15th day of the same, they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages that dwelt in the unwalled towns made the 14th day of the month Adar a day of gladness and feasting, and a good day, and of sending portions one to another. And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters unto all the Jews that were in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus, both nigh and far, to establish this among them, that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar and the 15th day of the same yearly. And as the days wherein the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month which was turned unto them from sorrow to joy, and from mourning into a good day, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, sending portions one to another and gifts to the poor. And the Jews undertook to do as they had begun, and as Mordecai had written unto them, because Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agite, the enemy of all the Jews, had devised against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast pure, that is, the lot, to consume them and to destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letters that his wicked device, which he devised against the Jews, should be returned upon his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Wherefore they called these days Purim, after the name of Pur. Therefore, for all the words of this letter and of that which they had seen concerning this matter, and which had come unto them, the Jews ordained and took upon them, and upon their seed, and upon all such as joined themselves unto them, so as it should not fail, that they would keep these 2 days according to their writing, according to their appointed time, every year, and that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, every city, and that these days of Purim should not fail from among the Jews, nor the memorial of them perish from their seed. Then Esther the queen, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew wrote with all authority to confirm this second letter of Purim. And he sent the letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, with words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim in their times appointed, according as Mordecai the Jew and Esther the queen had enjoined them, and as they had decreed for themselves and for their seed the matters of the fastings and their cry. And the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. This is all about a celebration. First of all, there's a day of rest. Concerning the Jews in the provinces, in verse number 17, verse 17 actually continues the sentence that is begun in verse 16. All of these activities, all of these activities that you see occurring happen on the 13th day. And the 14th day is the day of rest. Concerning the Jews in the palace, concerning the Jews in the city of Shushan, they assembled and defended themselves on the 13th day. And then Queen Esther asked for the extra day, remember? And so they killed 500 on the 13th. They killed another 300 on the 14th. They have rest on the 13th and 14th. And so the city folk, if you will, they have their day of rest on the 15th. Your day of rest is the day that their enemies are destroyed. They have a day of rest. This is the day of fasting, not feasting. They have a day of rest when their enemies are destroyed. Let me say it again. They separate the day of fasting and the day of feasting. The Feast of Purim is 2 days. It starts with a day of fasting. It ends with a day of feasting. The day of fasting is not a day of celebration. You don't get rejoicing on the day that your enemies were destroyed. They do not celebrate the destruction of their enemies. The next day, they celebrate the promises and the protection and the providence of God, but they do not celebrate the destruction of their enemies. I'd like to camp out there for a while. Proverbs 24, verse 17, rejoice not when thine enemy falleth, let not thy heart be glad when he stumbleth. I want to tell you that the Jews take this seriously. They not only took this seriously when they instituted the Feast of Purim, they didn't only take this seriously on the very day that their enemy fell, but they took this so seriously when they instituted this celebration annually. They took the date, the remembrance date, seriously. We're not ever going to have a celebration on the same date that the enemy fell, no matter what the year is. And you think it's important to remember a birthday. They remember the date that their enemy fell, and they will not celebrate on that date no matter what happened. That's how serious this is. We'll come back here in a moment. There is a day of rest. But that doesn't mean they don't celebrate, because they do. Some say that this is, I almost hate to say it. Some say that this is a Jewish Mardi Gras. It's a party. It's all about a celebration. I mean, how many times have we looked at celebrations in this book? Any excuse for a party, right? There is a day of rejoicing. We see that in verses 17 through 19. The next day, the day after, is the day of rejoicing. In the provinces, this is the 14th day. In the palace of Susa, this is the 15th day. This was the day of, we read from verse 22 and in verse 19, this was the day of gladness, a day of feasting. It is a good day. It's a day of sending portions. It's a day of sending gifts to the poor. The tradition that develops immediately after this war was that the Jews of the city would rest on the 14th day, the day that their enemy was destroyed. That was the day of fasting, to symbolize that their battle was over and respite was finally gained. And then on the 15th day, they would have a giant celebration. They would celebrate with feasting. They would have a parade. They would send gifts. They would send presents to each other. They would send gifts to the poor. But then in the villages, in those towns that are mentioned without walls, the day of rest was the 13th day, and the day of celebration was the 14th day. Now in verses 20 through 22, we see that the decree is recorded. Mordecai, the new prime minister, records this new decree. He says this holiday is known as the Feast of Purim because pure means lots, and they cast lots. That's how Haman decided which day would be determined to try to destroy the Jews. And so he says this will be called the Feast of Purim. Mordecai allows all the Jews in the empire to have these 2 days as a day of celebration. Mordecai sends out this decree. It's a permissive decree. You're allowed to have 2 days for celebration. At this point, it's a voluntary holiday. I mean, in this book, who doesn't like a good banquet, right? It's a voluntary holiday. If you're a Jew and you want to celebrate, you get 2 days to have a celebration. But in verse 23, right after the decree is recorded, we see that disorder is revealed, don't we? Mordecai writes his first letter, and the Jews undertook to do as they had begun, comma, and as Mordecai had written to them. Well, what did the Jews start to do? You see, when Mordecai wrote his first letter, he determined that the 14th and the 15th would be the days of remembrance. Do you see something going on already? Mordecai is obviously from the city. He's one of them city slickers. He's from the palace. He lives in town. He wants to celebrate the 14th and the 15th. But the Jews, the ones that lived out in the country, implied here as those that live in the provinces, well, they've already started the celebration a day early. They do as they have already begun. They started on the 13th. Did you pick that up there? This would mean that they continue to celebrate the 13th and the 14th while the Jews in the city are celebrating the 14th and the 15th. So others conform to the suggestion of Mordecai because he's the prime minister after all, and nobody goes against the new administration, while the Jews in the country, they celebrate the 13th and the 14th. And you see 2 political parties already starting to form. I mean, we had the Hamans, we had the Hamanites against the Mordecaiites. I just made those words up. Did you like that? And now that Haman and all his cronies have been booted out of office, and Mordecai is in office, now we see a little crack in the the Mordecai party. And we got the country Mordecaites against the city Mordecaites. See what just happened there? Well, we've already started celebrating the 13th and 14th, but Mordecai sent a letter, said you celebrate the 14th and the 15th. Now, I understand here there's an obvious time gap in these verses, but good grief, people. I mean, get it together. Come on. Do you understand what just happened here? You were just delivered from total annihilation. This entire worldwide empire just plotted genocide against your people, and it was just overturned. You've been living under a death sentence for 9 months, and now you've gained favor with an emperor. After 9 months, you've been granted rest from your adversaries. You have actually agreed that there should be an exchange of gifts. You've agreed that there should be a celebration. You've agreed that there should be a feast. You've agreed that there should be a big party. But now you're going to argue over which day to have the county fair. Get it together, people. You know what this sounds like? You know it's coming, right? Sounds like a bunch of snooty Baptists. It sounds like us when we start discussing our pet holidays. Because we like our holidays this way. And if you don't celebrate your holiday the way I celebrate this holiday, then you're a heretic. I mean, yeah, I know you got the same deliverance I got, and I got the same deliverance you got, but if you don't celebrate just like I do, then I'm not fellowshipping with you anymore. Yeah, I know we overlap by a day, but I start earlier than you do. I mean, we open our presents on Christmas Eve, and you're a heretic if you wait till Christmas morning. Do you know Baptists that fight like that? Well, I won't tell on them. Verses 24 through 28, there's a determination for remembrance here. Haman is destroyed. The Agagite is gone. Haman's plot has been turned onto himself in verse 25. Psalm 9, verse 15, the heathen are sunk down into the pit that they made. In the net which they hid is their own foot taken. That principle still works today. When you lay a trap for somebody else, you might want to watch where you put your foot. The days of remembrance now are going to be called Purim, the casting of lots, the manner that Haman used to plot his vengeful scheme. In verse 27, the Jews, and verse 27 has this other phrase here, that's all such as joined themselves unto them. So it's the Jews, and it's also all the Jewish proselytes, those that wanted to become Jews. They agree to make these 2 days a perpetual remembrance. We call that an ordinance. Verse 28, these days are going to be used to educate their children. You must teach your children the importance of these events. You must teach your children how the nation was preserved through the perilous times of their potential destruction. And here's how this is done today. Today, on the day of rest of Purim, they all go to their local synagogue. And the book of Esther is read twice. It's read once on the day of fasting. It's read again on the morning of feasting to start the party. They use noisemakers. Anytime they come to the name of Mordecai, everybody cheers Mordecai. Yay! Yay, streamers, the whole deal. Anytime the name of Haman is read, it's boos, it's hisses, gag, you choke it out. In fact, the reader may even spit his name out. You know, that wicked Haman. The narrator actually, when he comes to verses 7 through 10, the narrator has to read all 10 names of Haman's sons in a single breath because they all died together on Haman's gallows by the same method. In the last 4 verses, verses 29 through 32, we see the disagreement resolved. In verse 29, there's a second letter that is sent from Mordecai and from Esther. This letter is sent to all of the provinces and all of the people. The text essentially makes the celebration mandatory. It's a mandatory observance for all of the Jews. See verse number 27. Keep these 2 days according to the writing and according to their appointed time every year. It's mandatory. The Feast of Purim is now added to the regular calendar of feasts during the annual cycle of celebrations. I want you to know this. The Feast of Purim is never commanded anywhere in the Mosaic Law. It's not in the law of Moses. But there's more to be done than just keeping the law. The Queen's decree here confirms the matter. We see in verse 32, they write these into the book of the acts of Mordecai and King Ahasuerus. What is the resolution? How did they resolve this disagreement among the Jews? Verse 31. To confirm these days of Purim in their times appointed, according as Mordecai the Jew and Esther the queen had enjoined them, and as they decreed, what's those next 2 words? For themselves and for their seed, the matters of the fastings and their cry. And the decree says this: you must remember. You must teach your children. You are responsible to teach these things to your children, to your seed that comes after them. You must remember. You must keep a day of rest every year on this feast. You must keep a day of remembrance every year on this feast. Which day? Really? Which day? It didn't say. He didn't tell us. Did you notice that it doesn't tell us? Have you memorized Romans 14, verse 5? If you haven't, I encourage you to memorize Romans 14, verse 5. One man esteemeth one day above another. Another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. Pick your day. I don't care. Pick your your day. And whatever day you like, pick your day and celebrate your day and use your day to teach your children and quit arguing with everybody. Somebody say amen. Or say ouch. Yeah, that's borrowed. All of the Jews today celebrate their day of rest on the 13th of Adar. And the feast, the day of feasting, the day of gifts, the celebration meal is on the 14th of Adar. Unless, has to be an exception, right? Unless you live in Jerusalem or Jericho or Hebron. We heard in Sunday school about Levitical cities. 3 of the Levitical walled cities at the time of Joshua entering into the land of Canaan are considered to be walled cities, and they participate on what's called Shushan Purim. Shushan Purim is held on the 14th and the 15th. It seems like to me, if you live in a walled city, you celebrate the 14th and the 15th. And if you live anywhere else, you celebrate the 13th and the 14th. It's the principle that matters. Hang with me. Can we finish Esther? Are you tired of me beating up on you? I hope I'm not beating up on you. There's a continuation. That's the celebration. Let's look at the continuation. Chapter 10. And King Ahasuerus laid a tribute upon the land and upon the isles of the sea, and all the acts of his power and of his might, and the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai, whereunto the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was next unto King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people, and speaking peace to all his seed. This is a continuation. In verse number 1 of chapter 10, notice there are new laws. New laws. King Ahasuerus has lost a lot of money in this whole affair. I mean, he's been to a lot of battles, hasn't he? He's recently lost a war with Greece. He's just a few years past his lost campaign with the budding and upcoming Greek Empire. He's lost a lot of subjects. I mean, he just lost more than 75,000 in 2 days, right? And do you remember how he had so many horses and mules, and he had this early kind of what we think of as a Pony Express to get his word out to all the regions of his empire? Well, I'm sure the rumors of this civil war have spread, and they probably got to Greece, right? And Greece is just itching for another round. They're just itching for another run at expanding their empire. And since they hate this empire and they hate King Xerxes, I mean, they're coming for him, right? By the way, he's going to be defeated by this very nation, by Greece. Not too long, his son gets whipped up on. So King Xerxes needs to increase his defenses, doesn't he? He needs to secure his borders. Wow, it'd be so easy to get political, wouldn't it? What happens when you need to increase your defenses and secure your borders? You borrow money and raise taxes. And King Ahasuerus laid tribute upon the land and upon the isles of the sea. And that's exactly what he does. He raises taxes. Have you ever noticed that the more things change, the more they stay the same? There's nothing new under the sun. And I just remind you what I said last week. There is no human government that has any solution for the ubiquitous problem of man. Sin requires a savior. There is no help from any political leader. Which brings me to the second point we observe here, and that is in verse number 2, we see new leadership. Power corrupts, doesn't it? Back in the beginning of this book, Mordecai was quietly assimilated to his pagan culture. He wanted to keep the benefits of prosperity in the Persian Empire. So now at the end of this book, what has changed? Well, the more things change, the more they really stay the same, right? Not much has really changed, has it? I mean, the text is very clear on this point. It was the king that advanced him. Doesn't say the Lord advanced him. Doesn't say the Lord blessed him. It was the king that advanced him. It doesn't say it was the God of heaven that blessed him, the king. And so when we think about it, there's really not a lot of wonder that God doesn't attach his name anywhere in this book. We're not reading about the biography of Daniel. This is not a commentary on the moral virtues of Joseph leaving Potiphar's house. Not once does Esther pray to God. It may have been implied when she called for a 3-day fast. But it's never stated directly that any of these folks prayed to God. Not once does Mordecai thank the Lord for his intervention. Not once does Mordecai give God the glory for his providence. We're left to wonder, does it ever really cross their mind that God has ordained these events? But God is active, isn't he? He's very active. God is going to keep his promises. He's going to save his people. He's going to do it in incredible ways. He's going to do it in extraordinary ways. The providence of God is using the ordinary means to accomplish his extraordinary ends. Notice that these are miracles of timing, or they're miracles of technique. But God always accomplishes his will. And in verse 3, we see a new league, which we alluded to earlier. The new authority in charge has brought with it some new aspirations. The right party is out, the left party is in. Or is it the Labor Party is out and the Green Party is in? Or pick your political flavor. I don't care, and I'm not aligned with any of them. The historical narrative here reads like a referendum on a midterm election. Especially a midterm election on a lame duck president. Not unlike what maybe we've seen in the recent past, or perhaps we hope to see in the near future. Or again, pick your party. I don't care. It doesn't matter. We're all corrupt. They're all corrupt. Mordecai here, next to King Ahasuerus, is the new power broker. His people are going to be favored. And they are in verse number 3. And please understand, I'm not mourning over this, and I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm glad that the Jews are being favored. I'm just observing the facts here. One faction has been overthrown, another faction has risen to power, and they're going to wield that power for what they can gain by it. And the more things change, the more things stay the same. Because we know that this empire hasn't miraculously changed to become good, has it? Ahasuerus is still the same old corrupt, evil king. I mean, if you read your history books, you'll find out that in just a few years, most commentaries will tell you it's about 10, maybe 12 years from this. King Xerxes is assassinated in his own bedroom, and he's assassinated by members of his own cabinet on the orders of his own family. So in 10 to 12 years, since this man is so corrupt that his own family wants him assassinated, I want to ask you a question. Where's Queen Esther? Where's Mordecai? Purim begins in the mid-5th century BC, and just a few years later, in 465 BC, King Xerxes is assassinated, and we hear nothing about it from Esther or Mordecai. Some say that Vashti was actually brought back into favor. So quickly, I want to give you some considerations, principles for thought. The first one is God's placement is always for God's glory. God's placement is always for God's glory. God's deliverance came to these Persian Jews not through an ordained clergy, not through a priest. It was just two ordinary people that were doing ordinary jobs, and God chose to use them in extraordinary ways. They weren't really holy. They weren't particularly righteous. They weren't even spiritual. In fact, when we read those early chapters, they weren't even really seeking as you and I would think about it today. You know, they made a lot of mistakes. They were manipulative. They were maneuvering. God used them anyway. In spite of their circumstances, and might I be so bold as to say, in spite of themselves. Two observations there. You can make your situation worse when you refuse to follow God's leading and you disobey his laws. And that includes repentance. Remember that that's why Haman was impaled. Secondly, and positively, you don't have to be a preacher, and you don't have to be a pastor. You don't have to have any kind of special position to be used of God. You have a great effect for the kingdom right where you are. You just be willing to do what God asks you to do right where he's planted you, because you have been planted for God's glory in the place where he wants you. Secondly, God's people always need to celebrate God's goodness. Again, you people just won a great victory over the enemy. The response is not, let's fight amongst ourselves over which day to celebrate. The observations recorded here in this chapter should help us consider how we think about our own celebrations. Holidays. Holidays. Oh my. Do you know that Baptists tend to argue about holidays more than anything else? Good grief, people. Get a grip. Silent night. Holy night. It's almost never silent. And I would venture to say it's never holy. I'm not going to meddle. I mentioned things earlier. Resurrection Sunday is not Easter. It's every week. All week. Week-long birthday celebrations. Should the birthday we celebrate be the day of our new birth, not the day of our physical birth? I wonder what would happen to our family if we didn't celebrate birthdays at all. We just counted the day we were born again. And we just ignored the rest of all the birthdays. I watched a Pentecostal funeral this week. It was very interesting. It was a celebration. It was a going home celebration. I'll tell you this, the Jewish custom is they celebrate the day of a person's death. Literally. They celebrate the day of death. And they mourn on birthdays. And that's actually scriptural. It's much more scriptural than how we celebrate birthdays. Ecclesiastes 7:1, a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. Job 14:1, man that is born of woman is a few days and full of trouble. And I want you to know, I'm not against holidays. I'm really not. I'm not a Puritan. I love to feast. You're going to see that in a few minutes. I exchange gifts. And on purpose, I reach out to those that are less fortunate. But we need to think about what we're doing. I'll read you this from Ian Duguide. He said, the Puritans refused to celebrate Christmas, and they refused to celebrate Easter annually. And they did so not because they were against celebrations. On the contrary, they wanted to stress the fact that we celebrate the great reversal in our lives. We celebrate the great reversal in our lives every Lord's Day when we gather with his people. For them, and I would add it should be for us also, for them, every Sunday is Christmas morning. For them, every Sunday is Easter. For them, every Sunday is a Thanksgiving feast. I think they know something we don't. There should constantly be a celebration and a joy in our worship, because we need to understand and we need to remember the great reversal, the death from which we have been spared. That's why we are here. And so many times I get the impression that we're stuck back in chapter 2. We're stuck back in chapter 3. Remember what that was? Remember our summary of chapter 2? We don't remember how the disagreement even started. But we still fight. We attend the same church. We listen to sermons about brotherly love, and we have guns between our knees and propped against the wall. We'll even comment on the benefit of the sermon, and then we'll proceed with our killings. And killings isn't about gun. Killings happens with our tongue when we speak an evil word, or we speak a hateful word, or we have an unkind thought. I'll move on. God's providence is always under God's governance. Thankfully, in this book, even the people involved are not in control of God's sovereignty. God's providence worked through imperfect people using imperfect means in impossible circumstances. God's providence worked in spite of evil rulers conspiring directly against God's people. God's promises were kept to God's people by using God's providence. God's people were protected, and God's promises were provided. He does according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. None can stay his hand or say to him, "What doest thou?" And the primary promise of God that was provided was that God was protecting, he was preserving the promised seed. The promised seed of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, Judah, David, Solomon. He was protecting the one that would result eventually in the birth of a baby that we so often forget to celebrate. Another king, a king named Jesus, who didn't come to rule an evil and corrupt empire. He came to rule as the king in the heart of his people, because his kingdom is not of this earth. His kingdom is a spiritual kingdom. It's a king that is a spotless king. He's a safe king. He's a secure king. And I want to tell you today, that King Jesus is a saving king. And all of this that we read in the book of Esther is God intervening in history so that one day he can give us a saving king. Haman wanted to destroy the bloodline that would lead to Christ. And God said, no, there will be a Savior. Esther and Mordecai lived under a death sentence. And you and I live under a death sentence. But that death sentence is countered by a new decree. Today, we live under that death sentence called sin. The wages of sin is death. Death passes on all men. It's a guarantee. And just like this king's decree, there's no escape, there's no evasion, there's no extension, and there is no countering that decree. But there is a new decree. There is a new law. There is hope in a Savior. There is hope in a King that says, "Come to me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you," here's that word, that's the key word of all of this book, "I will give you rest." And we will have a day of rest, a day that we don't celebrate once a year or once in our lifetime or even once a week. It's a day that we can celebrate once a week when we get here with our brothers and sisters, but it's a day of a great reversal that you can celebrate every single day of your life. Come to me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you what Haman and Satan and every other enemy of God's people has tried to take away from you. I will give you rest. Are you here today and you need that rest? I implore you, I beg of you, I plead with you to do exactly what Christ has said. Place yourself under that new decree. Come to Christ. He says, I will give you rest. There's a rest for the people of God. You must repent and believe the gospel. Let's stand. Brother Derek, if you'll come.